Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me once again. And we are going to be talking all things investment and investor-led today. I am delighted to be joined by Vanessa Warwick, who runs the Landlord Community Property Tribes. We've spoken before. She's got a ton of information and has got a real finger on the pulse as to what investors are thinking about and how the land lies as far as that is all concerned. What a year 2020 was, Vanessa. Goodness me, ups and downs, and it behaved very, very strangely, didn't it? The whole housing market. Not what we expected at all, really.
I don't think anybody could have predicted how 2020 would pan out, Phil. I remember this time last year doing my property predictions, looking in my crystal ball to see what would happen. No, nobody could have predicted it. I mean, landlords are already facing, quite significant headwinds for the past 5 years with the onerous tax regime called
it felt that
24.
Things had been made sort of quite deliberately unattractive for landlords, and then of course we had a pandemic.
Exactly. So it's just another layer of difficulties and challenges that landlords are going to have to face up to and navigate. And
does that mean, from your side of things, from property tribes, that actually landlords do need communities and they do need to get together and hear advice and share ideas and that kind of thing? It's probably becoming ever more important, isn't it?
Never more so, Phil. The typical landlord in the UK, well, 97% of them, if we take home lets figures, for example, which we tend to quote, 97% of landlords in the UK are small landlords with 3 properties or less. So the chances are that they don't actually even think of themselves as a landlord because they're a vet or a teacher or a solicitor or a key worker, they've got busy workaday worlds. They've got a few properties on the side as a pension hedge or a legacy for their children, and they're not in a landlord mindset or mode at all. And so when a problem occurs, they can feel quite isolated and not sure where to go to for help. So online communities like property tribes, you're absolutely right, have become even more important, and we've seen a huge influx of new members who are experiencing problems due to the pandemic and who are seeking advice and support.
Well, you're putting lots of good information their way in a nice, easy and simple way for them to understand. As you say, many of them, the vast majority of them, are amateurs, and they're kind of feeling their way, but feeling their way during what was already a challenging time is pretty, can only be unpleasant. How on the whole do you think landlords have coped with 2020?
I think the landlords that have remained informed and educated and understanding what support measures are out there for their tenants, they have survived. I know it's becoming harder and harder for some. Some are really struggling. We are hearing of a lot of landlords who are selling up because they've got tenants in very significant arrears and they can't see an end to it with the eviction ban. They've tried to work with tenants to keep tenancies maintained. I myself, I think we maybe mentioned last time, I had one tenant that was struggling and I offered them a 50% rate, rent rebate with a payment plan to make it up when they went back into employment after furlough. Landlords have behaved very compassionately and with empathy on the whole, because let's not forget that most of these small landlords are also struggling themselves in their own day jobs and careers and businesses. So they don't have unlimited buffer of funds to support mortgages through the pandemic, and some are definitely coming to the end of their tether. And we hear some incredibly sad stories, and nobody wins because the property gets repossessed if the landlord doesn't pay the mortgage, and then of course the tenant is out on the street.
So we need to find an extra home for the tenant, and the landlord's in a kind of credit situation and a court situation. It's kind of hard yards everywhere you look on that topic, and people are being trapped, aren't they? Both landlords and tenants. Obviously, and let's talk about the eviction notice suspension, because that definitely helps tenants, and it stops people hitting the streets, which is another complete disaster. And I've seen firsthand what is happening on the streets, and it's not pretty. There are great government support. We've got lots of support in lots of areas of life at the moment, but it is sort of temporary support. But in terms of the eviction notice, how are landlords dealing with that? How are they feeling about it?
Well, they're feeling incredibly frustrated because landlord confidence is largely based on being able to regain possession of a property if the tenant stops paying the rent, or damages the property, or there are other issues within the property that doesn't make the tenancy sustainable. And not being able to gain possession and not seeing on the horizon when that could perhaps happen is extremely frustrating for landlords. I mean, we've got the 6-month notice period at the moment, but then you have to add on all the court backlogs, etc. And in some instances we're seeing it taking over a year or even 18 months for cases to even get into in front of a judge. So it's incredibly frustrating.
Is there any help? Is there any help for landlords in that situation?
Well, not a great deal. I mean, I do want to point out that, as you rightly stated, Phil, there are a lot of measures provided by the government, such as furlough payments, grants for the self-employed, housing benefit. So I do sometimes have to wonder why tenants can't pay their rent unless they've fallen through one of the gaps in the government support. That there must be ways for tenants to maintain tenancies, and unfortunately there will be, as in any crisis, a minority of people that seek to take advantage of it. And some tenant support organizations and unions have suggested that tenants stop paying their rent. Of course, landlords have been offered the mortgage deferment. I'm not going to call it holiday because it's not. It's a deferment. And I think lenders are being as tolerant as possible with this situation, trying to support landlords with these mortgages.
There again, it's kind of kicking the can down the road. The debt is still on the mortgage, the landlord still owes it. It's a really, really tough situation. And I feel also very sorry for the commercial landlords, because actually businesses, they go bust. They walk out the door, board up the shop or the restaurant or the pub, and that's it. They've completely gone, vanished. The landlord has no recourse, but he's still got a massive debt. And the likelihood is we're going to see a lot more of that in the months ahead, don't you think?
Definitely, and we do have a commercial property tribe on the forum.
How are they feeling about things?
Well, exactly as you said, we're starting to see reports coming in of commercial landlords who are really, really struggling. And I think the thing is that there's just no end in sight for any of this. We've gone into a third lockdown in early January. We don't have a clear indication of where it will end. And it's just very challenging for everybody, to know how they can find a way forwards.
Are any of your landlords looking to expand their portfolios? Is anyone seeing this as a time of opportunity, or is everyone sort of taking flight?
I think for the more experienced and seasoned landlords who do have, strong cash reserves, and I think this is one of the determining factors between, the professional landlords and the amateur landlords. I think the amateur landlord has been, very weak business models have been exposed. We've had some landlords on property tribes who cannot survive 1 month without a rental payment, and I think that is too weak a business model. You are going to get a non-paying tenant at some point, even if there isn't a pandemic on. And we've always recommended at property tribes to have, a few months cash reserve for these curveballs that inevitably come at landlords, even without the kind of crisis that we're experiencing at the moment. So weak business models have been exposed, but the more professional landlords, yes, they've got where they are because they can always see an angle or an opportunity. Yeah. And I suspect that many of them are sitting on the sidelines and kind of waiting until the end of the stamp duty holiday, because I think that's when there should be some bargains to be had. I mean, I know you've been in the media, Phil, talking about you feel that there's a definite cliff edge on the horizon, and I'm inclined to agree with you.
Yeah, I can't help feeling that there will be chaos. Chaos will ensue if that's the date, and if you're not completed on that date, you don't get the money. It seems madness to me. An easing, sort of tapering off of the holiday would seem to make a lot of sense without causing, the Chancellor needs money. I get that, but causing unnecessary chaos seems a bit strange. Just something occurred to me over the last couple of days, Vanessa, and it was due to the students going back or not actually going back to university, and the fact that the universities and various people have ploughed into the student accommodation market very heavily. I was actually thinking more about halls of residence and kind of more the institutional investors, perhaps rather than your individual property tribes investors, but they are affected as well. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on it. Students aren't able to get back to their halls of residence or wherever they live, but they've got to carry on paying for it. They can't get a job because there aren't any. Hospitality is shut. They can't leave university, go off traveling. They're doing all of their study probably from where they were spending Christmas at mum and dad's, and yet they're being asked to pay rent and accommodation because their possessions are still in the halls of residence, but they can't get access to them. That produces, again, really difficult debates, doesn't it? I'm throwing this out of the blue at you, I appreciate it, but it occurred to me over the last couple of days. Have you any thoughts on that one?
Well, yes, and already on Property Tribes, we're seeing student landlords saying that their tenants have been in touch and asked for a very significant reduction from the rent, or don't want to pay any rent at all. And again, it goes back to there's no end of this lockdown in sight. If we knew that, for instance, it was going to end at the end of February, yes, then we could come to terms with our tenants, and student landlords could say, well, I'll give you a 10 or 20% discount for the next couple of months, and then we can review it then. But I think, again, it just goes back to there's no end in sight. And I've heard of students that are thinking of returning home abroad because they can actually, run their courses online. So I think the student sector is extremely challenging. Big institutional investors and universities, etc., they can probably survive better than a small landlord with 2 or 3 properties, all in the student sector. And I think, once again, this just shows how important it is to have a diverse range of investments across a lot of different sectors, because if one sector is really shocked, at least you've got your other investments supporting the ones that are struggling. So many lessons to be learned from the whole COVID-19 economic fallout and what happens during lockdowns.
So Vanessa, just so I've understood that correctly, so a good balanced portfolio would have perhaps one student rental, one HMO, a couple of family houses. It would have urban. It would have. That's what you mean, isn't it? A good balanced sort of basket.
Yeah, I mean, I always advise starting off with single occupancy standard buy-to-let tenants on an AST. Yeah. I look at those types of property as like the foundations of a solid portfolio. So you would want to have a strong raft of those low risk, or admittedly lower yield properties to start with, because they're much simpler to operate, and you can
or small family houses.
Yeah, exactly. They're simple to operate. The tenants tend to stay longer. You can learn to be a landlord in a low risk environment. Once you've got that solid foundation of single occupancy buy-to-lets, then think about diversifying. HMOs. I'm a big fan of holiday lets. I've been advocating for them for the last 11 years, and now they're really coming into their own. And maybe some commercial as well. So yes, it's that goes back to the old saying, don't have all your eggs in one basket.
And nowadays, we touched on earlier the complications that landlords have faced over the last 5 years, and the fact that the legislations are much more stringent and more complicated to understand. Would you advise people to get management assistance? I mean, it's an extra cost, and it takes quite a chunk out of your kind of profit margins. But my feeling is in these days of complications, you don't want to get it wrong. Actually, you probably need a professional advisor to look after your rental and your management. Would you agree with that?
I most certainly do. If you are an amateur landlord and you're not 100% clear on your legal obligations, of which there are hundreds, and perhaps even more importantly in the current landscape, if you're not sure how to robustly reference a tenant, then you should definitely think about using a reputable and registered, compliant lettings agent. I use them for all of our properties, all fully managed. I think that a reputable agent is worth their absolute weight in gold. I regard them as almost like a partner in my business. So for less experienced landlords that don't have the experience, you should definitely work with an agent, because it most definitely mitigates risk, in my opinion. But you do need to understand how to do due diligence on an agent and make sure that they are compliant to all the government regulations. And I also recommend to look for an agent that has voluntarily committed to professional standards by joining a trade body such as ALA or Safe Agent.
Yeah. Great. You're absolutely right. It's very easy to get things wrong nowadays, and it's tough. It's tough enough as it is. You don't want to be out there doing wrong things and then being penalised. It's tough. Crystal ball time, I'm afraid. and I absolutely take your point. You're 100% right. We don't know when this is going to end, but let's imagine it's ended and enough of the population have been vaccinated and the hospitals are under control and the schools are back and we're feeling better by, when should we say, May. Stamp duty holiday is over. Furlough scheme is over. The chances are we've got rising unemployment and things are looking a bit awkward on the street. But sentiment for housing, sentiment for investing, take a pot shot. Where do you think things will be?
I think there are very challenging times ahead. When the furlough scheme runs out, we're going to see the true extent of unemployment across the UK. My top tip really, Phil, is that going forwards, it's going to be quality rather than quantity. So I'm suggesting that good quality properties in strong areas with good quality tenants are going to fare a lot better over the coming months than in poorer areas, with tenants that perhaps wouldn't pass a robust referencing test today. So definitely quality is going probably the years ahead, actually. And I've always found in any downturn, and I've been through 2 years, I've always found that the quality properties in my portfolio, of which always fared a lot better and recovered a lot more quickly than the stock that is in less quality areas. So that would be my top tip for landlords who are thinking of expanding. to definitely think about what they're buying. The risks have been massively amplified due to COVID-19 economic fallout, as you rightly indicated. So you've really got to be extra cautious. But I think, challenging times ahead for everybody. We're very, as you said, we're very fortunate that the property sector has remained open. And this does show that the government, recognises the importance of it. And it's a massive economic driver in the UK. So all I can say is my crystal ball is very, very fuzzy. But I think that people have really got to become educated and informed about their investment decisions going forward, and apply extra levels of due diligence.
Yeah, couldn't agree with you more. Looking back to this year, I've always thought that sentiment drives the housing market. And you would have thought in the middle of a pandemic, sentiment would have been dragging along the floor, but we've had a 6.5% rise in property prices. It seems mad, but I am slightly troubled by the fact, but by that number, 6.5%, and people have been talking about how busy agents are and how there is a backlog of conveyancing and surveyors, and it's all taking time, and everyone's trying to push to get through to the stamp duty holiday. But who is that moving? And I worry that there is we've got a situation of the haves and the have-nots, and the wealth gap is going to get bigger. And people who have been able to move have probably taken a bit of a hit. They've got some cash in the bank. They're still employed. They might be working from home, but they're still employed, and they're able to make the move to the countryside or whatever it is. But actually, that is in fact, it's a tiny proportion of the country. And there are far more people who haven't moved, who haven't been part of those statistics or that 6.5% rise, who will be in a tough spot right now. And that tough spot, they don't even know what tough spot is because of all the temporary measures that we've talked about. So, but sentiment's a strange thing.
Well, I think, obviously the house price appreciation was probably driven in the latter part of the year when the housing market was unlocked from the first lockdown, because in the first lockdown it was also lockdown. So there is this kind of pent-up demand, definitely. And I think it's a kind of false inflation. And unfortunately, or whatever your view may be, obviously the media has jumped on that and hyped it up. To my mind, it's a temporary and slightly false inflation, a bit like having an energy drink. You get that massive burst of energy, and then it just drops away really quickly. And I think
a bit rubbish afterwards.
And then I think, there'll be a lot of sales that actually fall out of bed because the buyer realizes that they're not going to meet the stamp duty deadline, and they're just going to pull out at the last minute. That's going to cause a lot of pain for vendors. It's we haven't seen anything like this in our lifetimes, and it's very, very hard to see how it's all going to pan out. But personally, I'm not particularly excited by talks of capital appreciation. I think there will be they will be countered next year when there will be a price drop. There's not an average property anywhere in the country. It's all micro markets, and this again points back to understanding your patch, your local area, your investment area. You have to know it inside out to be able to make informed decisions. So there's going to be winners and losers in the property sector, as there is in any crisis.
Yeah, and the government will have to be looking at housing in terms of a tax source, whatever form that comes, whether it's capital gains tax or some other tax. That is going to be something that investors are going to have to watch very carefully.
Yep.
So what I'm picking up, Vanessa, is top tips are chiefly is if you are going to invest, do it strategically, do it carefully, do it with advice, management advice, and the flight to quality.
Yes, indeed. And you mentioned lettings agents. They are a wonderful source of due diligence and intel. They know which streets are popular with tenants in their area. They know where they've got tenant waiting lists. So I would recommend calling at least 3 local lettings agents in the area that you're thinking of investing in and asking for their opinion about tenant demand. You have to create, you have to make sure that there's a demand before you create a supply. Too many people, create the supply and then hope that there's a demand. But using local lettings agents for intel is a really good way to ascertain what the demand is, the type of properties. There might be a demand for, say, 3 or 4 bed family homes, but there's an oversupply of 1 and 2 bedroom flats. So you need to understand that. Use the local agent's knowledge. And one really good way to mitigate risk, in my opinion, and I've always stated this, but I think it's even more important to think about during our current pandemic situation, is to think about buying a tenanted property. Because there are many, many advantages. Namely, you earn income from day one of ownership. You can check the tenant's history of paying the rent, make sure that they pay on time. You can actually see how the how the tenant is keeping the property, how they're living in it, if they're looking after it. And tenanted property may well come with an agent attached who has a relationship with that property and that tenant. So one way to greatly reduce risk is to think about buying a tenanted property, because then straight away that there's a demand for that because the tenant's already living there.
So actually you're ahead of the game already because you've got no void periods, you've got income from day one.
Exactly.
Vanessa, hugely appreciate your time and advice. It's going to be an interesting year. We've had a bumper year. It's probably going to be another bumper year, but who knows who knows? None of us have a crystal ball. Even yours is a bit fuzzy, you said.
No, it most certainly is, but I am, and I'm sure you're the same, Phil. I'm going to keep the faith with property. We have a very strong, mature market here in the UK. And the fundamentals of why I started investing in property 18 years ago haven't actually changed. So when I have a wobbly moment, as I have had quite a few over the last few months, I always think back to, well, why did I get started in property in the first place? And I look at how, property has done me right over the last 18 years, and I believe that it will continue to do so. But I do just urge every landlord or potential landlord to really make sure that they get the right advice, using online communities like Property Tribes, using the intel of local agents, using Move IQ. You produce a lot of very useful resources. There's so much free stuff out there to help landlords become informed and educated, and also very recommend joining a landlord association like the NRLA, who have loads of useful resources for landlords, and they also have a 9 to 5 landlord helpline where you can ring if you've got a problem tenant or a situation that you don't know how to deal with it. So it's definitely, the game is changing. Landlords are going to have to become more professional if they want to survive.
I mean that's a good thing. That's a good thing. I'm with you entirely. My properties are all wonderfully still let. Same as you. We've had to do a couple of deals along the way, but I'm in it for the long term as well.
I'll just jump in there, Phil, if you don't mind, because you said long term, and this is a key thing for me. It's still a very long term game, and I urge people not to make short term or knee jerk reactions to things when it is such a long term game. I encourage everybody to take a little bit of time to let things settle. There's always an acute phase of any kind of element of a crisis. You don't want to be making decisions in an acute phase. You want to wait till it's settled down, till the waters have calmed a bit, and that you can see a bit more clearly how it's going to impact you. And we've got to think long term in property. We always have, maybe even longer term now because of COVID, but do not make short term or knee jerk decisions with what is essentially a very long-term investment, because I believe anybody that does that will come to regret it.
Great advice as always. Your time is very much appreciated. Good luck with everything that you're doing on Property Tribes. It is a wonderful resource, and as you say, at this particular time, I think landlords need all the help and advice they can. So thank you so much.
Well,
Nice.
thank you, Phil. And just to say that, none of us is as smart as all of us. And that's why resources like Property Tribes, Move IQ, and the other communities out there are so valuable and can assist and support landlords during this difficult time. But Happy New Year to you.
None of us are as smart as all of us.
I can't take claim for that. But it's our kind of strap line or slogan.
It's good. I really like it. Lovely to talk to you.
Happy New Year.